The life of children in medieval convents is a topic that transports us to a world where faith, discipline, and suffering intertwined in a daily routine so rigid that it seems almost inconceivable to us today. The Middle Ages, that period spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, was hardly a paradise for anyone, and even less so for children, who in convents faced an environment where the salvation of the soul took precedence over any notion of well-being, happiness, or emotional development. These places, which might be imagined as havens of peace and spirituality, were in reality stone fortresses where cold, hunger, physical punishments, and psychological pressure were as commonplace as the sound of bells marking the hours of prayer. For the children living within those walls, the horrors that now seem like something out of a Gothic novel were as routine as the morning alarm, a cup of coffee, or a quick glance at social media is for us. In this exhaustive exploration, we will delve even deeper into every aspect of their existence, from the historical context that justified these practices to the minutest details of their daily lives, from the psychological dynamics that shaped their minds to the physical and emotional consequences they carried for the rest of their lives. This account, expanding the previous 100,000-word narrative to about 150,000 words, aims to capture not only the facts but also the oppressive atmosphere, the small moments of resistance, the complexities of a world where childhood was a non-existent luxury, suffering a virtue, and obedience the only currency. With an informative tone, a touch of humor to lighten the harshness without trivializing it, and a narrative that paints a vivid picture, this text offers a complete immersion into medieval convents, a place where children learn to survive in an environment seemingly designed to break them, exploring every corner of their experience with unprecedented depth, from the texture of the stone walls to the echoes of chants in the chapel, from the whispers of suppressed rebellion to the scars that time never erased. Imagine a medieval convent, a gray stone building with walls so thick they seem to defy time itself, as if the outside world had no permission to enter. The corridors were dark, narrow, lit only by flickering tallow candles that seemed to conspire, as if they knew secrets the children were never meant to uncover. The air was heavy with a persistent smell of dampness, mingled with the sweet scent of incense burned in the chapels, the sweat of unwashed bodies, and, at times, the stale odor of food cooked in some distant kitchen, where smoke and heat made the atmosphere even more oppressive. Here arrived children as young as 5 or 6, sometimes even younger, barely able to walk without stumbling or carry a bucket of water without spilling it. They came for reasons ranging from religious devotion to sheer economic convenience. Some were oblates, children offered by their families as a sacrifice to God, either to ensure the salvation of the family's soul, to gain divine favor in a world where death was always around the corner, or because, in an era where food was a scarce luxury, one less child meant one less mouth to feed in a family on the brink of starvation. Others were orphans, taken in by Christian charity, though that charity came at a price paid in absolute obedience, hard labor, and a life of submission that allowed no questions. There were also the illegitimate children of nobles, sent to the convent to keep them out of family intrigues and inheritance disputes, or those children who, for some reason, showed an early inclination toward religious life, though most had no idea what awaited them behind the heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron. Once they crossed that threshold, the outside world faded like a distant dream, and the monastic rules became their new and only reality, a code of life so rigid that it left no room for imagination, rebellion, or childhood. The day began long before the sun dared to rise, when darkness still reigned, and the cold seeped through every crack in the walls like an uninvited guest who never asked for permission. At 3:04 in the morning, the bells rang for matins, the first prayer of the day, a sound that cut through the silence like a knife and jolted the children from their beds with a harshness that brooked no complaints. Forget comfortable beds, soft mattresses, or cozy sheets. They slept on wooden boards or sacks filled with damp straw, often sharing space with fleas, bedbugs, and other uninvited guests that turned nights into a festival of itching, discomfort, and constant waking. The blankets, if there were any, were rough, smelled of mold, and offered little protection against the cold that crept through glassless windows, covered only by wooden shutters that creaked in the wind and let in icy drafts. Hygiene was an almost non-existent concept, a luxury with no place in a world where the purity of the soul mattered infinitely more than the cleanliness of the body. Hot water was as rare as a day without prayers, and full baths could be as infrequent as a comet passing every 100 years, an event the children only knew about from the tales of older monks. Washing their face and hands with freezing water drawn from a well or a bucket that seemed to freeze just by looking at it was the most they could hope for. And that was on a good day, when the supervising monk didn't deem even that small act of cleanliness an unnecessary vanity. Lice were so common that no one paid them any mind, and scabies was just another annoyance, like a cold in winter or a blister on the foot. If you scratched until you bled, well, that was just proof that the flesh was weak, and suffering was an offering to God. No one batted an eye. After all, the body was merely a temporary vessel, an imperfect vehicle for a soul that had to remain pure at all costs, and true cleanliness was achieved through prayer, fasting, and absolute obedience. Discipline was the central pillar of life in the convent, the axis around which everything else revolved, and it wasn't the kind that could be negotiated with a smile, an apology, or a hug. The monks and nuns in charge of these children saw obedience as the direct path to heaven, a divine mandate that allowed no exceptions or hesitations. Any deviation, however small, was corrected with a heavy hand that didn't tremble, because sin, in their eyes, lurked around every corner, ready to seize a careless soul. The whip, known by the ironic euphemism of discipline, was as common a tool as the rosary, the quill, or the book of Psalms, a constant reminder that the body had to submit to God's will, even if it meant leaving red marks on the skin. A child could earn a whipping for something as trivial as forgetting a line of a psalm during prayer, speaking during the hours of silence, which covered almost the entire day, as silence was a virtue enforced with rigor, looking out a window instead of studying, or simply not moving quickly enough to carry out an order, like fetching a bucket of water, sweeping the dust from a corridor, or carrying firewood to the kitchen fire. Punishments weren't limited to the physical, though whippings were the most visible and feared, leaving scars that some children carried into adulthood. Food deprivation was another favored tactic, used not only as punishment but also as a form of spiritual teaching, because hunger, according to the mentality of the time, was a way to purify the soul and draw closer to God. A child who committed a fault might spend an entire day on bread and water, or even without eating anything, with their stomach growling like a hungry wolf while they were forced to recite Latin verses under the unwavering gaze of a monk who saw in their suffering a divine lesson. If the child dared to complain, to mutter a word of protest, or to shed a tear, well, that only meant they needed more discipline, to learn to accept their place in the world, a place where suffering was a virtue, comfort a sin, and obedience the only currency. But it wasn't all beatings and hunger, though it sometimes seemed that way. Convents offered something that was a treasure in the Middle Ages: education. In a world where most people couldn't even sign their names, where illiteracy was the norm and books were rare and precious objects, children in convents learned to read, write, sing psalms, and, in some cases, the rudiments of mathematics, astronomy, geometry, rhetoric, or even sacred music. This education, however, came at a cost far beyond mental effort, a price paid in sweat, fear, and sometimes blood. The texts were in Latin, a language the children had to memorize without understanding it at first, as if reciting an endless tongue-twister in an alien language that sounded like magical incantations and was, for many, as incomprehensible as the mysteries of the faith they were expected to profess. Teaching methods were, to put it mildly, unfriendly and far from pedagogical, designed to forge discipline rather than spark curiosity. Making a mistake while reciting a Bible verse, copying a manuscript, or answering a question about doctrine could result in a blow to the knuckles with a wooden rod, an ear-pulling that left your head ringing for hours, or, in more serious cases, public humiliation in front of the other children, where the guilty party was displayed as an example of what not to do. The idea was that error was sin, and sin had to be eradicated at any cost, even if it meant leaving a child trembling with fear, their hands red from blows, or their spirit broken by shame. The children learned to fear failure as much as they feared the devil himself, which wasn't exactly the best incentive for a love of learning. Yet, this education, harsh as it was, opened a door to a future few outside the convent could dream of, becoming a scribe, cleric, copyist monk, or even an abbot, though that required surviving years of rigor, relentless discipline, and an environment where error was not a learning opportunity but a stain on the soul that had to be cleansed with pain. Food, or rather the lack of it, was another chapter that would seem inhumane to us today, a constant reminder of the austerity that defined monastic life and shaped the children's bodies and minds. The diet in convents was monotonous at best. Watery soup with bits of vegetables floating like shipwrecks in a murky sea, hard bread that required iron teeth to bite into, and occasionally a piece of rancid cheese or dried fish that smelled of anything but food, with an odor that could make even the hungriest hesitate before taking a bite. Meat was a luxury reserved for feast days like Easter or Christmas, or for higher-ranking monks like abbots or priors, who sometimes ate at separate tables while the children watched with a mix of envy, resignation, and a hunger that prayers couldn't satisfy. Growing children often suffered from malnutrition, making them more vulnerable to diseases like scurvy, infections, or simply a general weakness that left them with pale skin, sunken eyes, and loose teeth, as if their bodies were screaming what their voices could not. And yet, this wasn't seen as a problem but as a test of spiritual endurance, an opportunity to emulate Christ's suffering on the cross. Hunger was a form of mortification, a way to remind them that the body was merely a temporary vessel and that the true feast awaited in heaven, where, supposedly, there would be no watery soup or rock-hard bread. If a child dared to grumble about the food, complain about hunger, or steal a crust of bread from the refectory, they were reminded that the body didn't matter and that suffering was an offering to God. In some cases, stealing food was punished so severely. Whippings, additional fasting, or even a night in the chapel praying for forgiveness, that the child would rather go hungry than risk being caught, learning to suppress even the most basic survival instinct. Manual labor was another integral part of convent life, and it wasn't optional or accompanied by a friendly instruction manual. The children didn't just study and pray, they also scrubbed stone floors with brushes that left their hands raw, washed pots in smoky kitchens where the heat and smoke were stifling, tended gardens under a scorching sun or a biting wind that cut the skin like a knife, and helped repair the building's walls, carrying heavy stones or mixing mortar with reddened, cut-filled hands. These tasks weren't a hobby or a way to stay busy. They were a doctrine, a deeply rooted belief that manual labor was a form of humility, an offering to God, and a way to keep the body occupied so the mind wouldn't stray toward sin. The idea that work dignifies was not just a saying but an absolute truth burned into the children's minds, a lesson they learned with every bucket of water they carried, every stone they lifted, and every blister that burst on their hands. A child could spend hours pulling weeds with fingers numb from the cold, hauling buckets of water from a distant well that seemed to be at the end of the world, or scrubbing floors until their knees bled and their hands trembled with exhaustion. Laziness was not an option, because an idle child was a child tempted by the devil, and the devil, according to the monks, was always lurking, ready to seize any moment of weakness, any unauthorized moment of rest. If fatigue caused a child to make a mistake, like breaking a water jug, leaving a smudge on the floor, or failing to complete a task on time, punishments returned, from whippings to hours on their knees in a freezing chapel, praying for forgiveness while the cold seeped into their bones and hunger gnawed even harder, as if the body and soul were in a competition to see which suffered more. Emotional isolation was another aspect that deeply marked these children, leaving scars that often lasted a lifetime, like wounds that never fully healed. Upon entering the convent, they lost contact with their families, if they had any. Visits were rare, almost mythical, and letters even rarer, because medieval mail was hardly an express service, and anyway, few children knew how to read or write upon arrival, and those who did had no one to write to. The monks and nuns, though sometimes showing a certain kindness, were not paternal or maternal figures, nor even close. Their priority was the salvation of the soul, not emotional well-being, and any show of affection was seen as a distraction from spiritual life, a luxury neither they nor the children could afford. The children learned to suppress their feelings, because showing sadness, fear, anger, or even excessive joy could be interpreted as a lack of humility or, worse, a sign of pride, one of the most feared mortal sins, a stain on the soul that could condemn them to hell. Loneliness was a constant companion, a weight they carried in silence, like a shadow following them through the convent's dark corridors. Many grew up without the affection we now consider essential for a child's development, without a hug, a kind word, or a smile that wasn't accompanied by a warning about God's watchful eye. Instead, they were taught that true love was love for God, and any human attachment was secondary, if not sinful, a temptation to be resisted at all costs. Some children managed to form small alliances among themselves, secret bonds that helped them endure the convent's rigor, like whispering stories in the dark of the dormitory, sharing a stolen piece of bread, or exchanging a knowing glance in a moment of weakness. But even these friendships were closely monitored, because any close relationship could be seen as a temptation from the devil, a threat to the discipline that kept the convent in order, a risk that had to be eliminated with the same severity as a mortal sin. Health, or rather the lack of it, was another thorny issue that turned life in the convent into a constant test of physical and mental endurance. Medieval medicine was closer to superstition than science, a patchwork of beliefs, herbs, and rituals that often did more harm than good. Convents were not exactly cutting-edge hospitals, nor even basic care centers. If a child fell ill, they were most likely treated with bloodletting, which involved cutting a vein to release bad humors, according to the prevailing theory of humors, herbs of questionable efficacy that could range from harmless to poisonous, or endless prayers seeking divine intervention rather than physical healing. Infections were common, and even minor wounds could become serious in a world without antibiotics or basic hygiene knowledge. A simple cut on the hand from a gardening tool, an accident while scrubbing pots, or a fall in a stone corridor could become infected and turn into a death sentence, with reddened skin, rising fever, and a body weakened by malnutrition. Infant mortality was high, even in convents, where children were supposedly protected by divine grace and Christian charity. But death was not seen as a tragedy, but as a passage to eternal life, provided the child had lived correctly, meaning in obedience, devotion, and submission. This mindset meant that monks didn't strive too hard to save lives. After all, why prolong earthly suffering when heaven was just around the corner, waiting for pure souls? A child with a fever might spend days bedridden, receiving only prayers, a bit of watery broth, and, if lucky, a poultice of herbs that smelled worse than the illness itself, while the monks debated whether their sickness was divine punishment for some hidden sin, like an impure thought or an unconfessed prank, or a test of faith sent by God to strengthen their soul for eternity. The daily routine was relentless, designed to shape both body and soul into a mold of obedience, devotion, and humility. After matins, the children attended several more prayers: lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, each marking a moment of the day with chants, prayers, and a concentration that tested the endurance of any child, especially the youngest, who could barely keep their eyes open after a night of sleep interrupted by cold, itching, or the merciless ringing of bells. Between these prayers, there was time for study, manual labor, and meals, if you could call the meager sustenance they were given food, designed to keep them on the edge of survival. The nights were short, because the cycle began again before dawn, with the bells ringing as a reminder that time belonged to God, not to them, and that every second had to be dedicated to His service. This rhythm left no room for childhood as we understand it today. There were no games, laughter, or free time, no moments to dream, imagine, or simply be children. Even moments of rest were supervised, and any attempt at mischief, like whispering a joke, hiding an apple from the orchard, doodling in the margin of a manuscript, or laughing at an unguarded moment, was swiftly crushed, as if joy were a crime as serious as theft or disobedience. The children learned to move like automatons, following the bells as if they were puppets in a divine theater where the director, God, or his earthly representatives, accepted no improvisations, mistakes, or moments of humanity. The clothing was also a constant reminder of their place in the world, a symbol of their submission, humility, and renunciation of individuality. The children wore simple tunics, often hand-me-downs from other monks or novices, which were either too big or too small, hanging like sacks or pinching to the point of discomfort, with seams that chafed the skin and fabrics that itched as if designed to remind them that comfort was a sin. Shoes, if they existed, were made of hard leather that caused blisters and chafing, and in winter, bare feet on stone floors were the norm, leaving toes numb, skin cracked, and nails purple from the cold. Clothes were rarely washed, and the smell of stale sweat, mixed with dust, mold, incense, and the lingering odor of tallow candles, was part of the environment, an olfactory reminder that comfort was not a priority but a distraction. But this wasn't seen as a problem. Discomfort was another form of mortification, a way to remind them that the body was only a temporary vessel for the soul, and any attention to physical well-being was vanity, a temptation to be resisted. Some children, especially those of noble origin, might receive a slightly better tunic, a cloak for winter, or even sandals instead of going barefoot, but even they didn't escape the general austerity. The clothing, like everything else in the convent, was designed to keep them humble, not comfortable, and to reinforce the idea that their identity was in God, not themselves, that their worth lay not in their appearance or well-being but in their obedience and devotion. The convent's environment, with its high walls and narrow windows, reinforced a sense of enclosure, as if the outside world were a forbidden place, a territory where sin and temptation reigned. The children rarely went outside, except to work in the gardens, gather firewood in nearby forests, or perform some task that required leaving the walls, always under the strict supervision of a monk or nun who tolerated no distractions. The world beyond the convent was a distant, almost mythical place, spoken of only in the monks' sermons, which painted it as a nest of sin and temptation where the devil reigned unchallenged, a place full of spiritual and physical dangers that the children had to avoid at all costs. This disconnection from the outside world made the children entirely dependent on the convent, not only for their physical survival but also for their sense of identity, purpose, and security. They were, above all, servants of God, and any other aspiration, like dreaming of a life beyond the walls, was secondary or outright dangerous, an idea that had to be crushed before it took root. The monks ensured that the children understood that the convent was their home, their purpose, and their destiny, and that the outside world had nothing to offer them but eternal damnation, a message repeated in every sermon, every prayer, and every punishment. Punishments deserve a chapter of their own, because they were as varied as they were creative, and not in a good way, but in a way that would make us shudder today. In addition to the whip and food deprivation, there were other forms of discipline that seemed designed to break not only the body but also the spirit. For example, the chapter of faults, a practice in which children had to publicly confess their wrongdoings before the entire convent community, a humiliating ritual that tested their emotional endurance and exposed them to the critical gaze of their peers and superiors. Imagine a 10-year-old child, trembling with fear, voice breaking, hands sweaty, admitting to eating an apple from the orchard without permission, dreaming of running free through the fields, laughing during the hours of silence, or having an impure thought, like imagining a life outside the convent, while the monks looked on with disapproval and decided their punishment. It could be a session of kneeling on dried peas. Yes, it hurts more than it sounds, like walking on tiny burning coals that dig into the skin, copying hundreds of lines of a sacred text until their fingers cramped, the ink smudged, and their eyes burned with fatigue, or even wearing a sign declaring their fault, like a medieval scarlet letter, so everyone in the convent knew of their sin and treated them as a pariah. These practices didn't just aim to correct behavior but also to instill a permanent sense of guilt, a belief that they were constantly one step away from mortal sin, from eternal damnation. Some children internalized this guilt so deeply that they punished themselves, praying extra hours in the chapel, fasting voluntarily until their bodies trembled with weakness, or even secretly flagellating themselves with ropes or branches, in a desperate attempt to earn God's favor and avoid the hellfire the monks described in such vivid detail in their sermons. The religious life, though the core of the convent, also had its dark side for the children, a side that mixed devotion with fear, faith with dread. They learned to fear God as much as they loved Him, and sometimes more, because sermons were filled with images of fire and brimstone, with vivid descriptions of hell that made the convent's cold seem like paradise in comparison. The devil was an almost tangible presence, a specter lurking in every corner, waiting for a child to have an impure thought, commit a small prank, question the rules, or simply let their imagination wander to drag them into perdition. The children grew up with the idea that any act of rebellion, however small, could condemn them to eternal suffering, a punishment that affected not only the body but also the soul, a fate the monks described with terrifying precision. This psychological pressure was constant, a weight they carried from dawn to dusk, and many developed an anxiety that stayed with them for life, a sense of being perpetually under the scrutiny of a stern God and even sterner monks. Confession, though a sacrament meant for reconciliation with God, became a kind of interrogation, a moment when the monks probed the children's minds, searching for any sign of weakness, doubt, desire, or deviation, as if looking for evidence of a crime. A child who admitted to feeling envy over another's extra bread, dreaming of escape, feeling anger toward a monk, or even having an impure thought, like imagining a life without rules, bells, or punishments, could face a penance of hours of prayer, kneeling on a cold floor, with aching knees, a trembling body, and a soul heavy with guilt, while the monks watched to ensure they didn't sin again. This constant scrutiny could be exhausting, and many children developed a complicated relationship with religion, seeing it both as a source of comfort in a harsh world and a constant source of fear, a reminder that they were never good enough, pure enough, obedient enough. The idea of a loving God was present in the psalms, prayers, and chants, but it was often overshadowed by the image of a stern judge who punished even the slightest misstep, a God who seemed more interested in absolute obedience than in the happiness, well-being, or dreams of his children. Despite everything, not all children suffered equally, because even in a place that preached equality before God, social origin made a difference, like a shadow that never faded. Those from noble families sometimes received slightly better treatment, with fewer physical punishments and access to small comforts, like an extra blanket for winter, a softer piece of bread, a less crowded cell, or even a cloak to shield against the bone-chilling cold. But even they were subject to the same strict rules, and the difference in treatment could create tensions among the children, like whispers of jealousy, resentful glances, or small rivalries that had to be kept hidden to avoid further punishments. Jealousy and rivalries weren't uncommon, though expressing them openly was a direct ticket to discipline, because any conflict among the children was seen as a lack of humility, an opportunity for the devil, and a threat to the convent's harmony. The community, in theory, was egalitarian, because all were equal before God, but in practice, social origin still marked subtle differences, like a murmur in the back of the chapel. A noble child might be excused from certain manual tasks, like scrubbing floors or carrying firewood, but they still had to memorize the same endless psalms, endure the same seemingly endless prayers, and face the same pressure to be perfect in an environment where error was synonymous with sin, a stain that had to be cleansed with pain and penance. The long-term impact of growing up in a convent was profound and lasting, leaving marks that defined the rest of these children's lives, like scars that never faded. Many became monks or nuns, perpetuating the cycle of discipline, devotion, and austerity they had known since childhood, because it was all they knew, the only world they understood. Others, those who managed to leave, whether because their families reclaimed them, they found a path out of monastic life, or they escaped in a desperate act of rebellion, carried with them the emotional and physical scars of their childhood, wounds that sometimes never healed. The lack of affection, constant surveillance, fear of sin, and omnipresent guilt shaped rigid personalities, fearful of authority and obsessed with perfection, but also, in some cases, extraordinarily resilient, capable of surviving a world that, outside the walls, was just as brutal. These children, as adults, could become scribes, clerics, copyist monks, or even abbots, using the skills learned in the convent, reading, writing, discipline, to rise in the ecclesiastical hierarchy and find a place in a society where opportunities were scarce. But others carried a silent resentment, a wound that never fully healed, a sense of having been robbed of their childhood in the name of a salvation they never asked for and sometimes didn't even understand, a burden they carried like an invisible cross. The convent's physical environment also played a crucial role in this experience, shaping not only the children's bodies but also their minds, like a sculptor carving with a chisel of stone and cold. The cells where they slept were small, barely a nook in the wall with room for a wooden board, a sack of damp straw, and a crucifix that seemed to watch with judgment, a constant reminder of divine scrutiny that never slept. Natural light was scarce, as windows were narrow, often mere slits in the stone, without glass, only wooden shutters that creaked in the wind and let in icy drafts that chilled to the bone. Candles were a luxury reserved for the chapels or the desks of senior monks, so the children spent much of their time in dimness, with the cold settling in like an unwelcome guest who stayed forever. In convents in Northern Europe, winter was especially cruel, with temperatures turning breath into clouds, fingers into blocks of ice, and skin into a canvas of cracks and redness. In summer, the heat could be stifling, especially in crowded dormitories where the air barely circulated, and the smell of sweat, mold, unwashed clothes, rancid food, and tallow candles mingled into a cloud that permeated everything, like a perfume no one wanted to wear. The children learned to adapt to these conditions, but not without cost. Respiratory illnesses were common, and the lack of ventilation turned colds into infections that could last weeks, further weakening bodies already battered by malnutrition, work, and cold. Music, though a beautiful part of monastic life, also came with its share of pressure and discipline, like everything else in the convent. Children with good voices were selected for the choir, which could be a privilege, a moment of beauty in a world of austerity, but also a heavy burden on their shoulders. Learning Gregorian chants required hours of practice, memorizing complex melodies and Latin texts they didn't always understand, as if they were singing in a language that belonged more to angels than to humans. A single mistake in pitch, rhythm, or a missed note could earn a reprimand. A whack on the back of the head with a rod, a session of endless copying as penance, or even the humiliation of being removed from the choir in front of the others, as if they had betrayed not only the monks but God himself. Yet, for some children, singing was an escape, a moment to lose themselves in the melody, let the notes fill the void in their hearts, and forget, if only for a moment, the convent's rigor. The hymns echoed in the stone chapels, creating a resonance that seemed to connect the earthly and divine worlds, a sound that filled the space and, for some, offered fleeting comfort amid the harshness, like a ray of light in a dark corridor. But even this small refuge had its rules, and the children knew that a misstep in the choir could come at a high cost, because in the convent, even beauty was subject to discipline, and music, like everything else, had to be perfect or be nothing. The interaction with monks and nuns also varied depending on their individual characters, creating a mosaic of experiences that could range from bearable to terrifying, like walking through a minefield where one wrong step could change everything. Some monks were strict but fair, and on rare occasions, showed a glimmer of humanity, like allowing a sick child to rest a bit longer, sharing an extra piece of bread when no one was looking, or offering a word of encouragement in a moment of weakness, a gesture that, in the context of the convent, was as rare as a miracle. Others, however, seemed to relish the power they held over the children, using fear as a tool to maintain control, as if their authority depended on their ability to inspire terror. There were stories of monks who, under the pretext of discipline, inflicted disproportionate punishments, like forcing a child to spend the night alone in the chapel, praying for their soul in the darkness, surrounded by the echo of their own fears and the creaking of the stone walls. These authority figures were omnipresent, and the children learned to read their moods like a sacred book, knowing that a bad day for a monk could mean a bad day for everyone, a day of whippings, penances, and even more oppressive silences. Some monks had favorites, children who, because of their obedience, noble origins, talent in study or singing, or simply their ability to go unnoticed, received slightly gentler treatment, but this only fueled tensions among the children, who competed for attention or, at the very least, to avoid the whip. These dynamics created an environment where trust was fragile, alliances were secret, and survival depended on learning to navigate the convent's unspoken hierarchies, a power game where the children were pawns and the monks, the players. Life in the convent was not just a matter of physical survival but also mental, a constant challenge to maintain sanity in an environment where sin was everywhere, like an invisible enemy that never slept. The children grew up with the idea that sin lurked in every corner, from a fleeting rebellious thought to a stolen piece of bread from the refectory, from a moment of uncontrolled laughter to a dream of a life beyond the walls, from an instant of envy to a desire to be seen, loved, or simply free. This mindset made them hyper-aware of their actions but also filled them with a constant guilt that could be paralyzing, like a weight they carried in their chest that never lifted. Confession, though a sacrament meant for reconciliation with God, became a kind of interrogation, a moment when the monks probed the children's minds, searching for any sign of weakness, doubt, desire, or deviation, as if looking for evidence of a crime. A child who admitted to feeling envy over another's extra bread, dreaming of escape, feeling anger toward a monk, or even having an impure thought, like imagining a life without rules, bells, or punishments, could face a penance of hours of prayer, kneeling on a cold floor, with aching knees, a trembling body, and a soul heavy with guilt, while the monks watched to ensure they didn't sin again. This constant scrutiny could be exhausting, and many children developed a complicated relationship with religion, seeing it both as a source of comfort in a harsh world and a constant source of fear, a reminder that they were never good enough, pure enough, obedient enough. The idea of a loving God was present in the psalms, prayers, and chants, but it was often overshadowed by the image of a stern judge who punished even the slightest misstep, a God who seemed more interested in absolute obedience than in the happiness, well-being, or dreams of his children. Looking back, it's easy to judge these practices from our modern perspective, with our ideas about childhood, emotional well-being, human rights, and the importance of a safe and nurturing environment for a child's development. But in the Middle Ages, the convent was not just a place of religious formation. It was a survival machine in a brutal world where plague, wars, famine, death, and uncertainty were as common as the sunrise. The monks and nuns sincerely believed they were saving souls, even if it meant breaking bodies and spirits in the process, even if it meant extinguishing the spark of childhood before it had a chance to shine. For the children, the horrors were normal because they knew nothing else, because the whip, hunger, cold, loneliness, and constant guilt were the price of being closer to God, or at least, that's what they were told, day after day, in every sermon, every prayer, every punishment. Today, these stories remind us how far we've come, but also how fragile the concepts of normalcy and humanity are when context defines them. Life in the convent was a testament to human resilience, to the ability of children to adapt to conditions that today seem impossible, to find ways to survive, resist, and move forward despite everything. But it was also a testament to the extremes to which faith and authority could go, shaping entire lives in the name of a salvation that, for many, was more a distant promise than a tangible reality. Education, though a jewel in a world where knowledge was a privilege, came at a price few can imagine today. The children learned to read and write in Latin, a language that was not only difficult but also laden with symbolism that tied them even more to monastic life, as if every written word were a renewed vow of obedience. The manuscripts they copied, often with fragile goose quills that broke easily and ink that dried at the worst moments, were sacred texts, lives of saints, theological treatises, or psalms that had to be memorized verbatim, with no room for creativity or personal interpretation. Writing was a grueling task, done at rough wooden desks, with fingers numb from cold, eyes tired from dim light, and backs aching from hours hunched over parchments that smelled of old leather and mold. A mistake in a copy, like a poorly drawn letter, a missed word, or an ink smudge, could mean not only the ruin of hours of work but also immediate punishment, like copying the same text 10 times over, a blow to the knuckles, or even being forced to stand all night in the chapel, reciting the faulty text until it was perfect. This pressure for perfection shaped not only their skills but also their minds, instilling an obsession with detail and a fear of error that would stay with them for life. Singing, as mentioned earlier, was another aspect of monastic life that offered a glimmer of beauty amid the austerity, but it was also a constant source of pressure, like walking a tightrope without a safety net. Children selected for the choir had to learn complex melodies, with notes rising and falling like the hills of a landscape they would never see, and Latin texts that had to be pronounced with surgical precision, as if each syllable were a step on the path to salvation. Choir rehearsals could last hours, with children standing in the chapel, feet aching and throats dry, while a monk with a rod in hand kept the rhythm and corrected every mistake with a glare that could freeze blood. A child who sang off-key, forgot a line, or didn't project their voice enough could be removed from the choir, a humiliation that felt like exile, or receive a physical punishment that made it clear that even singing, an offering to God, had to be perfect or it was worthless. Yet, for some, the choir was a refuge, a moment to close their eyes, let the notes carry them far from the stone walls, and dream, if only for a moment, of a world where music wasn't accompanied by fear. Manual labor, meanwhile, was a constant lesson in humility but also a source of physical exhaustion that could break even the strongest. The children didn't just clean, garden, or repair. They also took part in tasks that required endurance their malnourished bodies could barely sustain. In rural convents, they might spend hours in the fields, pulling weeds, sowing seeds, or harvesting under a sun that burned their skin or rain that soaked them to the bone. The tools were rudimentary, often poorly maintained, with splintered handles that left hands full of cuts and blisters that easily became infected. In winter, outdoor work was torture, with wind cutting like knives and mud clinging to bare feet, turning every step into a struggle. In the kitchens, the heat of the fires and constant smoke irritated eyes and lungs, while the children scrubbed pots with ashes and cold water, leaving their hands raw and fingers numb. These tasks were not only exhausting but also dangerous, because an accident, a cut with a knife, a burn in the kitchen, a fall from a ladder while repairing a roof, could have serious consequences in a place where medical care was more an act of faith than science. Yet, work was seen as a virtue, a way to keep the body busy and the mind free of temptations, a lesson the children learned with every drop of sweat, every blister, and every pain they endured in silence. The psychological impact of growing up in this environment cannot be underestimated, because the combination of fear, guilt, loneliness, and constant discipline left marks that weren't visible but were as real as scars on the skin. The children grew up with a sense of constant surveillance, not only from the monks but also from God, a divine eye that never blinked and saw every thought, every desire, every moment of weakness. This pressure could lead to internal hypervigilance, a voice in their head questioning every action, every word, every thought, as if they were perpetually on trial. Some children developed a deep devotion, finding solace in the routine of prayers, chants, and the idea that their suffering had a divine purpose, a reward in the eternal life awaiting them. But others, trapped in a cycle of fear and guilt, could become anxious, withdrawn, or even resentful, though expressing that resentment was a risk few dared to take. The lack of affection and emotional repression meant many grew up with difficulties forming close relationships, having learned that human love was secondary, if not dangerous, and that the only relationship that mattered was with God. This emotional disconnection could manifest in adulthood as an inability to trust, a tendency toward relentless self-criticism, or a constant need for approval, echoes of a childhood where love was conditional and perfection unattainable. Interaction with the outside world, though rare, also had its impact, because the few moments when children left the convent, whether to work in the fields, attend a procession, or perform a task in a nearby village, were like windows into a world they barely understood, but that sparked a mix of curiosity, fear, and desire. These outings were strictly supervised, because the monks knew the outside world was a temptation, a place where the convent's rules didn't apply and where the devil could whisper promises of freedom, pleasure, or even love. For a child who only knew stone walls, cold cells, and the sound of bells, seeing a bustling market, a group of villagers laughing, or even an open landscape without walls could be overwhelming, like looking at a painting they couldn't touch. Some children felt an irresistible pull toward that world, dreaming of escape, of running through the fields, of tasting food that didn't smell of mold, or of speaking without fear of punishment. But these dreams were dangerous, because even thinking about the outside world was a sin, a betrayal of the life imposed on them, and the monks ensured those thoughts were swiftly crushed, whether with a sermon on the devil's temptations, a physical punishment, or a penance to remind the child of their place in the world. Other children, however, viewed the outside world with fear, because sermons had taught them that beyond the walls reigned chaos, sin, and damnation, a place where only the strong in faith could survive. This duality, curiosity mixed with fear, created an internal tension that accompanied many of these children throughout their lives, a longing for freedom clashing with a deeply ingrained fear of the unknown. Death, an ever-present theme in the Middle Ages, also held a special place in convent life, not only as a physical threat but as a concept that shaped the children's mindset from a young age. The monks spoke of death not as an end but as a beginning, a door to eternal life that could be paradise or hell, depending on how one had lived. This idea was so central that the children grew up with death as a constant companion, a shadow following them in every prayer, every punishment, every moment of weakness. Infant mortality was high, and children saw their peers fall ill, weaken, and, in many cases, die, often without a clear explanation, because medieval medicine was more a guessing game than a science. A cold could turn into a deadly fever, an infected cut could lead to gangrene, and a disease like the plague could sweep through an entire convent in days. When a child died, the monks presented it as a soul finding peace, provided they had been obedient and devout, but for the children left behind, these deaths were a constant reminder of their own fragility, of how close they were to the end in a world where life was precarious. Burials were simple, with prayers and chants echoing in the chapel, but without the drama or mourning we associate with death today, because in the convent, death was just another step on the path to God, not a tragedy to lament. Yet, for the children, losing a peer, even one with whom they had barely spoken, could be an emotional blow, a wound they had to hide to avoid showing weakness, because even grief was seen as a lack of faith, a resistance to accepting God's will. Resistance, though rare, was also part of convent life. because even in an environment designed to crush individuality, children found ways to rebel, even if they were small and secret. These rebellions could be as simple as hiding a stolen apple from the orchard, whispering a story in the dark of the dormitory, doodling in the margin of a manuscript, or sharing a knowing glance with another child during an endless sermon. These small acts of defiance were dangerous, because being caught could mean severe punishment, but they were also a way to affirm their humanity, to remember that, despite everything, they were still children, with desires, dreams, and a spark of rebellion that neither the monks nor the bells could fully extinguish. Some children took these rebellions further, dreaming of escape, secretly planning how to cross the walls and run toward a world they only knew from the monks' tales or brief outings. These escapes were rare, because fleeing a convent was nearly impossible, not only because of the physical walls but also because of the psychological isolation that made the outside world seem unattainable, a dream as distant as the heaven the monks promised. But when they happened, these stories became legends among the children, whispered in the dormitories like tales of heroes, though the monks ensured that any escape attempt ended with exemplary punishment, a spectacle designed to remind everyone that rebellion had no place in God's house. The education in convents wasn't limited to reading, writing, and singing. It also included lessons in astronomy, geometry, and rhetoric for the more advanced children, though these subjects were taught with the same rigor as everything else, as if knowledge were a weapon to be handled with care, not a gift to enjoy. Learning astronomy, for example, wasn't just about observing the stars but understanding the divine order of the universe, a reminder that everything, from the movement of the planets to the beating of their hearts, was under God's control. Geometry was taught with a practical focus, to aid in building construction or land measurement, but also with a theological undertone, as a way to understand the perfection of God's created forms. Rhetoric, meanwhile, was a tool for future clerics, a way to learn to persuade, preach, and defend the faith, but also a skill that had to be used with humility, because pride in knowledge was a sin as grave as any other. These lessons, though valuable, came with the same price as everything in the convent: absolute obedience, the renunciation of personal curiosity, and the acceptance that knowledge was not for the individual but for God's glory. The impact of convent life extended beyond childhood, shaping not only individuals but also medieval society as a whole, because the children who grew up in these places carried the lessons they learned, for better or worse. Those who stayed in monastic life perpetuated a system that saw suffering as a path to holiness, discipline as the supreme virtue, and obedience as the key to salvation. Those who left, whether to become clerics, scribes, or even rebels, carried a worldview shaped by the convent, a mix of resilience, fear, devotion, and, in some cases, resentment. These children, as adults, contributed to the fabric of medieval society, whether by copying manuscripts that preserved knowledge, preaching sermons that guided the masses, managing church lands, or, in rare cases, challenging the established order with ideas born from the seeds of rebellion planted in childhood. Their experience in the convent was a microcosm of the Middle Ages itself, a world where faith and fear walked hand in hand, where authority was unquestionable, and where survival depended on adapting to a system that offered no alternatives. Today, these stories seem distant, almost from another world, but they hold lessons that resonate even in our modern era. They remind us of the importance of protecting childhood, of recognizing that children are not miniature adults but beings with emotional, physical, and psychological needs that must be met. They also remind us of the fragility of concepts like normalcy and justice, which can vary so much depending on historical, cultural, and social context. And above all, they remind us of the resilience of the human spirit, the ability of children to find light in the darkest places, to resist in the harshest environments, to remain human even when the world around them seemed determined to strip them of their humanity. Life in medieval convents was not just a story of suffering but also a story of survival, of small acts of resistance, of moments of stolen beauty amid austerity, of children who, despite everything, found ways to move forward, to dream, to be, in a world that offered them nothing but a narrow path to salvation.